June 4, 1942, 10:20 a.m. Pacific Ocean, northwest of Midway Atoll. Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Kumano, 400 miles from the battle that would decide Japan's fate. Behind his flagship steamed 3 more heavy cruisers, Suzuya, Mogami, and Mikuma, 8-inch guns, 35 knots maximum speed, enough firepower to reduce Midway Atoll to rubble in an hour of sustained bombardment. Kurita's orders were simple: wait for Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers to crush the American air defenses, then race forward and shell Midway into submission before the invasion force landed. The cruisers would provide the hammer blow that would secure Japan's outer defensive perimeter. They would clear the way for 5,000 troops waiting in transports to occupy the atoll. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But Kurita's cruisers were 400 miles away. And at that precise moment, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was pushing his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber into a 70-degree dive above Nagumo's carriers. What happened in the next 6 minutes would render Kurita's powerful warships completely irrelevant. Japan had assembled the largest fleet in its history for the Midway operation, over 200 ships, 11 battleships including Yamato, the most powerful warship ever built, 15 cruisers scattered across multiple task forces, 4 fleet carriers with 248 aircraft, 65 destroyers. This was the hammer that would crush American naval power in the Pacific. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had made a fatal decision. He had divided this overwhelming force into multiple groups, spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. The carriers would strike first, alone. The battleships, including Yamamoto's own flagship Yamato, would follow 300 miles behind. The cruisers were split between close support, distant support, and bombardment forces. Each element was positioned to execute a specific phase of a complex, carefully choreographed plan. The plan required everything to work perfectly. The carriers would destroy Midway's defenses. The cruisers would bombard the atoll. The invasion force would land. The American carriers, if they appeared, would be lured into a trap where Japanese battleships and cruisers would annihilate them in a surface engagement. Japanese doctrine had prepared for this decisive battle for decades. The Imperial Navy had trained for the moment when superior Japanese fighting spirit and tactical excellence would destroy the American fleet in one climactic gun duel. But the plan had a vulnerability that Japanese planners had never seriously considered. What if the carriers were destroyed before the surface forces could intervene? What if the carefully orchestrated phases collapsed in the opening act? What if American dive bombers arrived at exactly the wrong moment, when Japanese carriers had their decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft? At 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, that vulnerability became catastrophic reality. McCluskey's dive bombers screamed down on 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. In 6 minutes, all 3 were burning wrecks. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, would be destroyed by afternoon. Japan's carrier striking force, the Kido Butai that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, was annihilated. And Kurita's cruisers, powerful enough to bombard Midway into rubble, sat 400 miles away, completely unable to affect the battle's outcome. To understand the profound irony of Midway, you must understand what Japan believed about naval warfare and how that belief shaped every decision Yamamoto made in planning the operation. The Japanese Imperial Navy in 1942 was built around a doctrine called Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle theory. This concept had dominated Japanese naval thinking since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 through 1905. The theory was elegant. Japan, as an island nation with limited industrial capacity, could never match the naval production of larger powers like the United States or Great Britain. Therefore, Japan must avoid wars of attrition. Instead, Japanese forces would train to a level of excellence that no enemy could match. When war came, Japan would concentrate its fleet and destroy the enemy in one climactic engagement. Superior training, superior tactics, and superior fighting spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. This theory had worked spectacularly at the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905. Admiral Heihachiro Togo's fleet had annihilated the Russian Baltic fleet in a single day of combat. The Russians had sailed halfway around the world only to be destroyed in the Tsushima Strait. Japanese gunnery, Japanese tactics, and Japanese leadership had produced one of the most one-sided naval victories in history. Togo had lost 3 torpedo boats. The Russians had lost 8 battleships and most of their fleet. Tsushima became the template: train harder than any enemy. Fight with discipline and courage that no enemy can match. Concentrate forces at the decisive point. Deliver one overwhelming blow. Win the war in a single battle. This doctrine shaped every aspect of Japanese naval development for the next 37 years. Japanese officers studied Tsushima obsessively. They analyzed Togo's decisions. They practiced fleet maneuvers endlessly. They built their doctrine around the assumption that the next war would be decided by another Tsushima. The problem was that Tsushima had been a gun battle between surface fleets, battleships firing at battleships, cruisers maneuvering for advantage, torpedo boats making daring attacks. The decisive weapon had been the naval rifle. The decisive platform had been the battleship. When Yamamoto planned the Midway operation in 1942, he was planning for a modern Tsushima. Carriers would strike first, yes. Carrier aviation had proven its value at Pearl Harbor, but the decisive battle would still be fought by battleships and cruisers closing for the kill once the carriers had weakened the enemy. Yamamoto's plan reflected this assumption. The carriers would attack Midway and destroy its air defenses. If American carriers appeared, Japanese carriers would strike them first, inflicting damage. Then the battleships and cruisers would move in for the kill. Japanese surface forces, superior in night combat tactics, would destroy whatever remained of the American fleet in a gun battle. The Americans would be lured into Japanese waters and annihilated, just like Tsushima. But this plan required the carriers to survive long enough to draw the Americans into range of Japanese surface forces. It required the battle to develop in phases, with each Japanese element playing its designated role in sequence. It required, above all, that nothing go catastrophically wrong in the opening phase. At Midway, everything went catastrophically wrong in the opening phase. The American codebreakers had read Japanese communications. They knew Midway was the target. They knew the date of the attack. They knew the composition of Japanese forces. Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned 3 American carriers northeast of Midway, hidden and waiting. The ambush force that Yamamoto expected to lure into a trap was already in position to strike first. When Japanese carriers launched their attack on Midway at 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, Admiral Nagumo believed American carriers were still at Pearl Harbor. His reconnaissance was inadequate. His search aircraft were too few to cover the assigned sectors effectively. One search plane from the cruiser Tone launched 30 minutes late due to a catapult malfunction. That plane's search sector included the area where American carriers were actually positioned. By the time Nagumo learned American carriers were present, his own carriers were in the worst possible situation. Half his aircraft were returning from the Midway strike, low on fuel and ammunition, needing immediate recovery. The other half were on the hangar decks, being rearmed. Bombs designed for attacking land targets were being removed. Torpedoes designed for attacking ships were being loaded. The process was half complete when the order came to rearm again for land attack because Midway had not been sufficiently damaged. Fuel lines lay exposed across the hangar decks. Bombs and torpedoes sat in carts, armed and ready but not yet loaded. Aircraft crowded the decks, being serviced and refueled. The carriers were packed with every combustible material a warship could contain, all in the most vulnerable configuration possible. And then the American dive bombers arrived. McCluskey's squadrons from Enterprise and Hornet appeared overhead at 10:24 a.m. At nearly the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown attacked from a different direction. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, dozens of Zero fighters, were all down at sea level. They had just finished slaughtering American torpedo bombers that had attacked earlier. The torpedo bomber attacks had been suicidal. 41 American torpedo bombers attacked, only 6 survived. Not one torpedo hit. But those attacks had pulled every Japanese fighter down low. The sky above the carriers was completely undefended. McCluskey rolled into his dive. 31 more dive bombers followed. They fell from 14,000 feet at 260 miles per hour. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese had no time to react. Anti-aircraft guns that had devastated low-flying torpedo bombers could not elevate fast enough to track dive bombers attacking from directly overhead. The carriers, turning into the wind to launch their counterstrike, could not maneuver. They were perfect targets. The first bomb hit Kaga at 10:25 a.m. It struck just aft of the island superstructure. The explosion detonated aviation fuel and armed bombs on the flight deck. 3 more bombs hit in quick succession. Within 60 seconds, Kaga was transformed from a powerful warship into an inferno. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Richard Best's section attacked Akagi. Best had pulled out of the dive on Kaga when he realized almost every other bomber was attacking that carrier. He chose Akagi instead. His bomb hit precisely amidships, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship as torpedoes and bombs detonated. The third carrier, Soryu, was attacked by bombers from Yorktown. 3 bombs hit in quick succession. Aviation fuel ignited. Ammunition exploded. Within minutes, Soryu was a blazing wreck. The attack lasted 6 minutes. When it was over, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were mortally wounded. More than 200 aircraft were destroyed or would burn with their carriers. Over 700 pilots and air crew were dead or dying. The Kido Butai that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had raided Darwin and Ceylon, that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, was effectively destroyed. And 400 miles away, Rear Admiral Kurita received the news aboard Kumano. The carriers were burning. The invasion of Midway was in jeopardy, but surely the battle could still be salvaged. Surely Japanese surface forces could still accomplish something. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding from the battleship Yamato 300 miles behind the carrier force, refused to accept defeat. He had assembled over 200 ships. The carriers were lost, yes, but the battleships remained. The cruisers remained. The invasion force remained. Midway could still be taken. Yamamoto ordered the operation to continue. The invasion transports were told to proceed. Cruiser divisions were ordered to close on Midway. Kurita's bombardment force received new orders. Race forward at maximum speed. Reach Midway by dawn on June 5th. Shell the atoll's defences. Prepare the way for the invasion that would occur later that day. Perhaps the operation could still succeed. Perhaps surface forces could accomplish what the carriers had failed to do. Kurita acknowledged the order. His 4 cruisers increased speed. 35 knots. The ships raced through the darkness toward Midway. They left their destroyer escorts behind because destroyers could not maintain that speed. By 2 on June 5th, Kurita was 90 miles from Midway. In 3 hours, his cruisers would be in bombardment range. But then new orders arrived. Admiral Yamamoto, finally accepting the magnitude of the disaster, had ordered a general withdrawal. The Midway operation was cancelled. All forces were to retire westward immediately. Kurita's cruisers, which had raced 400 miles through the night to bombard an enemy they would never reach, turned away. The bombardment mission was cancelled. The invasion was cancelled. Everything Yamamoto had planned was collapsing. As Kurita's ships executed their turn, a lookout spotted a submarine silhouette in the darkness. The submarine Tambor was patrolling west of Midway. Emergency turn signals flashed between the Japanese cruisers, but in the darkness and confusion, the signals were misinterpreted. Mikuma, third in line, turned 90 degrees instead of 45 degrees as ordered. Mogami, last in line, maintained the correct heading and suddenly found Mikuma's hull looming directly ahead. There was no time to avoid collision. Mogami's bow crushed into Mikuma's side, rupturing fuel tanks and crumpling Mogami's bow almost to her forward turret. Both cruisers were damaged. Mikuma began leaking a steady trail of oil. Mogami's speed was reduced to 12 knots. Kurita detached his flagship Kumano and the cruiser Suzuya to race westward and rejoin the main fleet. The two damaged cruisers, escorted by two destroyers, limped westward at 14 knots, leaving a trail of oil behind them that could be seen for miles. At dawn on June 5th, American search planes from Midway spotted the oil slick and followed it to the damaged cruisers. Marine dive bombers attacked. Army B-17 bombers attacked. The attacks caused additional damage but did not sink either ship. On June 6th, dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found the stragglers. 3 waves of attacks struck throughout the day. Mikuma was hit repeatedly. Fires erupted throughout the ship. By afternoon, the heavy cruiser that had been racing to bombard Midway 2 days earlier was a blazing wreck. She sank that evening, taking over 600 men with her. Mogami, despite catastrophic damage, somehow survived and limped back to Japan. She would spend a year under repair. The cruiser that was supposed to shell Midway into submission had instead been crippled in a collision with her sister ship while fleeing the battle zone. The irony was complete. Japan had brought overwhelming surface power to Midway: battleships, cruisers, destroyers. But these forces had been positioned too far away to affect the carrier battle. When Yamamoto tried to use them after the carriers were lost, they arrived too late and only added to Japan's losses. The fundamental problem was the dispersal of forces. Yamamoto had spread his fleet across hundreds of miles of ocean. The carriers advanced alone, unsupported by the battleships and heavy cruisers that might have provided additional anti-aircraft protection. The invasion force waited far to the west, unable to support the carriers. The battleship force followed so far behind that it could not reinforce Nagumo when disaster struck. Each element was positioned for its phase of a plan that assumed everything would work perfectly. When the carriers were destroyed in the first phase, the rest of the plan became irrelevant. The battleships could not reverse the disaster. The cruisers could not shell Midway without the carriers first suppressing the island's air defenses. The invasion force could not land without both carrier air cover and cruiser bombardment. Everything depended on the carriers surviving, and the carriers were destroyed in 6 minutes. The destruction of the carriers exposed the fundamental flaw in Japanese naval doctrine. The decisive battle theory assumed Japan would control the timing and location of the climactic engagement. Japanese forces would concentrate at the chosen point. Superior Japanese training and fighting spirit would deliver victory. But at Midway, the Americans controlled the timing. American codebreakers had read Japanese plans. American carriers were positioned for ambush. The battle occurred where and when the Americans wanted it, not where Yamamoto had planned. Japanese forces were divided because Yamamoto was executing a complex plan designed to lure Americans into a trap. But the complexity created vulnerability. When one element failed catastrophically, the other elements could not adapt. Battleships were too far away. The cruisers were assigned to specific missions that became impossible once the carriers burned. The doctrine that had worked at Tsushima in 1905 failed completely in 1942 because warfare had fundamentally changed. At Tsushima, the decisive weapon had been the naval gun. Fleets fought within visual range. The side with better training and better ships won. At Midway, the decisive weapon was the carrier aircraft. Fleets fought over the horizon. The side that struck first from the air won. Japanese surface forces, no matter how powerful, could not change the outcome because they could not reach the enemy carriers. American dive bombers destroyed Japanese carriers from 14,000 feet. Japanese battleship guns, for all their massive firepower, had a range of 25 miles. The battleship Yamato, which Yamamoto had positioned 300 miles behind the carriers, might as well have been anchored in Tokyo Bay. She was too far away to matter. The cruisers were equally useless. Kurita's bombardment force was positioned 400 miles from Midway because that was where Yamamoto's plan placed them. They were supposed to bombard after the carriers destroyed Midway's air defenses, but when the carriers burned, the cruisers had no meaningful role. Racing forward to shell Midway without air cover would have been suicide. American land-based aircraft would have destroyed them. So they turned back, accomplishing nothing except losing Mikuma in a collision caused by the chaos of retreat. The contrast with American force employment was stark. Admiral Nimitz had positioned his 3 carriers in a single task force northeast of Midway. They operated together, mutually supporting. When the battle began, all American carriers were in position to strike. There was no dispersal, no complex choreography requiring perfect timing. The American plan was simple: find the Japanese carriers, attack with everything available. The attacks were poorly coordinated. Squadrons arrived separately. The torpedo bombers were slaughtered, but enough attacks succeeded because all American forces were concentrated for the decisive action. Nimitz also had land-based aircraft on Midway itself. Marine fighters, Army bombers, Navy patrol planes. These aircraft could not sink Japanese carriers, but they harassed Japanese forces and forced Nagumo to keep half his aircraft armed for a second strike on Midway. That decision, to rearm for land attack, meant Japanese carriers had armed bombs and torpedoes sitting on their hangar decks when American dive bombers attacked. The land-based aircraft contributed to the vulnerability that made the carrier destruction so catastrophic. American submarines patrolled between Midway and Hawaii. The submarine Tambor, which Kurita's cruisers spotted, was part of a screen designed to intercept Japanese ships. Tambor did not sink any Japanese warships, but her presence caused collision that crippled Mikuma and Mogami. The submarine Nautilus, which had been depth-charged by Japanese destroyers earlier in the day, had led American dive bombers to the Japanese carriers by attracting the attention of the destroyer Arashi. When Arashi finished depth-charging Nautilus and raced to rejoin the carrier force, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey spotted the destroyer's wake and followed it straight to the Japanese carriers. Every American element, from carriers to land-based aircraft to submarines, was positioned to support the defense of Midway and the attack on Japanese carriers. The integration was imperfect. Communications failed. Coordination broke down. Individual attacks were poorly executed. But the concentration of forces meant that even imperfect execution produced overwhelming results. Japanese forces were dispersed for a complex plan that required perfect execution. When execution failed, dispersal became fatal weakness. The human cost of Japan's dispersal fleet became clear in the hours and days following the carrier destruction. Aboard Akagi, over 260 men died. Many were trapped below decks when fires cut off escape routes. Damage control parties fought desperately to contain the blazes, but the fires spread too quickly. Aviation fuel created rivers of flame that flowed through passageways. Ammunition detonated in cascading explosions. Men who reached the flight deck found themselves surrounded by burning aircraft and exploding ordnance. Captain Taijiro Aoki remained on Akagi's bridge, trying to save his ship until flames forced evacuation. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier striking force, climbed down a rope to escape. His staff followed. They transferred to the light cruiser Nagara and watched their flagship burn. Akagi remained afloat through the night of June 4th, but fires could not be contained. On the morning of June 5th, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into the burning hulk. Akagi, which had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, sank beneath the Pacific. Kaga's death was faster, but no less horrific. The 4 bomb hits had created fires throughout the ship. 800 men died. The carrier's list increased as flooding spread. By afternoon, the order came to abandon ship. Survivors jumped into the ocean. Destroyers pulled men from the water, but hundreds went down with the ship. Kaga sank at 7:25 p.m. on June 4th. The carrier that had carried 36 bombers to Pearl Harbor, that had struck targets across the Pacific, was gone. Soryu suffered the quickest death. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to abandon his ship. His officers begged him to leave. He refused. 718 men died with Soryu, including Captain Yanagimoto, who chose to go down with his command. The carrier sank at 7:13 p.m., rolling over and disappearing in minutes. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived long enough to launch counterstrikes that severely damaged the American carrier, Yorktown. But American dive bombers found Hiryu in the late afternoon. 4 bombs struck the carrier. Fires erupted. By evening, Hiryu was burning out of control. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the carrier division that included Hiryu, refused to leave his flagship. Captain Tomio Kaku refused to abandon ship. Both officers chose death over survival. At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, Japanese destroyers scuttled the burning wreck with torpedoes. Yamaguchi and Kaku went down with 392 men, 4 fleet carriers, over 3,000 men, 248 aircraft, all lost in less than 24 hours, and none of Japan's powerful surface forces had been able to prevent or reverse this catastrophe. The battleships, positioned 300 miles behind the carriers, never fired a shot at enemy ships. The battleship Yamato, 72,000 tons with 9 18-inch guns, was the most powerful warship in the world. She had been built to dominate decisive surface engagements. At Midway, she was irrelevant. Her massive guns could not reach American carriers operating beyond the horizon. Her thick armor provided no protection against carrier aircraft. Yamamoto commanded from Yamato's bridge, receiving reports of disaster he was powerless to prevent. The cruisers fared no better. 15 cruisers participated in the Midway operation. Only one, Mikuma, was sunk, and that occurred during the retreat after the battle was already lost. The cruisers had been positioned for specific missions in Yamamoto's complex plan: close support for the carriers, distant support for the invasion force, bombardment of Midway, pursuit of retreating American forces. But when the carriers burned, none of these missions could be executed. The cruisers became spectators to a disaster they could not affect. The destroyers, 65 of them scattered across multiple task forces, screened capital ships, and searched for submarines. They rescued survivors from burning carriers. They fired torpedoes to scuttle ships that could not be saved, but they could not change the battle's outcome. Destroyers were built for surface combat and anti-submarine warfare. They had no weapons that could reach American carriers launching strikes from 200 miles away. The contrast between Japanese force structure and the reality of carrier warfare was absolute. Japan had built a fleet for the decisive gun battle. The decisive battle at Midway was fought entirely by aircraft. Ships designed to fight with guns were useless in a battle fought from the air. This truth applied equally to American battleships, of course. The United States had no battleships at Midway. They were not needed. Admiral Nimitz had positioned his 3 carriers to defend the atoll and attack Japanese forces. That was sufficient. Battleships would have added nothing to American capabilities at Midway except additional targets for Japanese aircraft. The age of the battleship, as this dominant capital ship, was ending. Midway made this reality undeniable, but Japanese doctrine had not adapted. Yamamoto had positioned his battleships for the climactic surface engagement that never occurred. He had dispersed his cruisers for missions that became impossible when the carriers burned. The doctrine that assumed carriers were supporting arms for battleships was obsolete. Midway proved that carriers were now the dominant force, and everything else was supporting. The industrial implications were equally stark. Japan entered the war with 10 carriers, 6 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. After Midway, 6 remained, and 2 of those were damaged and undergoing repair. Japan's shipbuilding capacity could produce perhaps 1 carrier per year under ideal conditions. The industrial base was too limited. Resources were scarce. Skilled labor was insufficient. By contrast, the United States lost 1 carrier at Midway, Yorktown. 2 more Essex-class carriers would be commissioned before the end of 1942. By the end of 1943, the United States would commission 13 fleet carriers and 9 light carriers. American industrial capacity was so vast that losses could be replaced faster than combat could inflict them. Japan's industrial capacity was so limited that losses could never be fully replaced. The pilot losses were even more catastrophic. Japan had entered the war with approximately 3,500 trained naval aviators. After Midway, perhaps 3,000 remained. The training pipeline could not produce replacements fast enough to maintain this level. Japanese pilot training before the war had been extraordinarily selective and lengthy. Acceptance rates were low. Training consumed years. Standards were extremely high. This produced superb pilots, but in insufficient numbers. When losses mounted, Japan faced an impossible choice: lower standards to produce more pilots, or maintain standards and accept declining pilot numbers. Japan tried to do both and succeeded at neither. Training hours were cut. By 1943, new Japanese pilots graduated with 500 flight hours. By early 1944, that number had fallen to 200 hours. By late 1944, some pilots graduated with only 40 hours of flight time. These minimally trained pilots were sent into combat against American pilots who had logged over 500 hours before ever seeing an enemy aircraft. The American training infrastructure had been designed from the beginning to operate at wartime scale. Flight schools appeared across the country. Instructors rotated back from combat zones to share frontline experience. Standardized training programs moved students through primary, intermediate, and advanced phases with factory precision. By 1943, the United States was producing over 20,000 naval aviators annually. American losses could be replaced. Japanese losses could not. This disparity, more than any tactical decision at Midway, ensured Japan's eventual defeat. The strategic consequences of Midway became apparent within weeks. On August 7, 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. This began a 6-month campaign that would drain Japanese air power even further. The carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, which had missed Midway due to damage sustained at Coral Sea, participated in battles around Guadalcanal. Both carriers survived, but their air groups were decimated. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, Japan had lost hundreds more pilots and aircraft. The training pipeline could not keep pace with losses. By mid-1943, Japanese carrier air groups were shadows of their pre-war strength. The elite pilots who had trained for years before Pearl Harbor were largely dead. Replacements had minimal training and minimal experience. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, this became catastrophic. Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American fleet in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day. The kill ratio approached 11-1. American pilots described shooting down Japanese aircraft as effortless. The opponents were not the skilled veterans of 1942. They were students with barely enough training to find their carriers. By October 1944, when Japanese carriers made their final appearance at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the carriers were essentially empty shells. They carried few aircraft and had almost no trained pilots to fly them. The carriers were used as decoys, deliberately sacrificing themselves to draw American forces away from invasion beaches. It was a mission that admitted defeat, using carriers as expendable bait because they could no longer function as offensive weapons. The path from Midway to this humiliation was direct and inevitable. Japan lost the war the moment those 4 carriers burned on June 4, 1942. Everything that followed was the working out of mathematical certainty. Admiral Yamamoto understood this immediately. He had opposed war with the United States from the beginning. He had warned that Japan could win victories for 6 months to a year, but could not win a prolonged war against American industrial capacity. Midway proved him correct. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's offensive capability was broken. The margin of naval air superiority that had enabled conquest was gone. The experienced pilots, who could not be replaced, were dead. The carriers that required years to build were at the bottom of the Pacific. Yamamoto would continue to command the combined fleet, but his health declined. He became increasingly fatalistic about Japan's prospects. In April 1943, American cryptographers intercepted a message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases. Admiral Nimitz authorized an assassination mission. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down. The architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway was dead. His death was a direct consequence of American code-breaking, the same advantage that had enabled victory at Midway. The dispersal of Japanese forces at Midway became a case study in how not to plan naval operations. Military analysts would study the battle for decades, identifying the errors that led to Japanese defeat. Yamamoto's plan was too complex. It required perfect timing and coordination across forces, separated by hundreds of miles. When one element failed, the others could not adapt. The carriers were left unsupported, vulnerable to attack, unable to call on the battleships and cruisers that might have provided additional anti-aircraft protection. The assumption that carriers were supporting arms for battleships was obsolete, but Japanese doctrine had not caught up with reality. The decisive battle theory that worked at Tsushima in 1905 failed completely at Midway because the decisive weapon had changed. Naval guns could not hit targets beyond the horizon. Carrier aircraft could. The side that controlled carrier aviation would dominate naval warfare. Everything else was secondary. American planners understood this. They concentrated their carriers for mutual support. They positioned all forces within range to support the decisive action. The plan was simple and flexible enough to survive imperfect execution. Japanese planners created a complex choreography that required everything to work perfectly. When American dive bombers destroyed 3 carriers in 6 minutes, the entire plan collapsed. The statistics of dispersal tell the story with brutal clarity. Japan brought 11 battleships to Midway. Not one fired its main guns at an enemy ship. Japan brought 15 cruisers to Midway. Only 4 ever came within potential bombardment range of the atoll, and they turned back before engaging. 1 was lost during the retreat. Japan brought over 200 ships to Midway. Fewer than 20 experienced significant combat. The carrier striking force fought and died alone. The rest of Yamamoto's armada was positioned too far away to matter. If those battleships had been positioned with the carriers, providing anti-aircraft support, would the outcome have changed? Possibly. More anti-aircraft guns would have made American attacks more costly. But the fundamental vulnerability would have remained. Japanese carriers with their decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft were bombs waiting to explode. When American bombs hit those vulnerable targets, no amount of anti-aircraft fire could undo the damage. The real question is whether concentrating forces would have prevented American dive bombers from reaching the carriers at all. If Japanese battleships and cruisers had been steaming with Nagumo's carriers, they would have added dozens more anti-aircraft guns to the defensive screen. They would have increased the volume of fire that American aircraft had to penetrate. More American planes might have been shot down before reaching their targets. But the Japanese combat air patrol was already down at sea level when the dive bombers attacked. The sky above the carriers was undefended regardless of how many ships were present. Anti-aircraft fire from surface ships, however intense, could not compensate for the absence of fighter cover at altitude. The torpedo bomber attacks that preceded the dive bombers had pulled Japanese fighters low. Those attacks were suicidal. 41 American torpedo bombers attacked. Only 6 survived. But those sacrifices created the opening that made the dive bomber attack successful. If Japanese forces had been concentrated, if more anti-aircraft guns had been available, the torpedo bomber losses might have been even higher. But the fundamental dynamic would have been unchanged. Low-flying torpedo bombers would have been engaged by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. High-altitude dive bombers would have attacked from above, while defenses were focused below. The real failure was not the dispersal of surface forces. The real failure was inadequate reconnaissance that allowed American carriers to achieve surprise. Japanese search aircraft were too few and launched too late. The search plane from the cruiser Tone that was supposed to cover the sector where American carriers were positioned launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems. By the time that aircraft reported American ships, Nagumo's carriers were already in a vulnerable configuration. If Japanese reconnaissance had detected American carriers earlier, Nagumo could have launched a strike before American aircraft arrived. The battle might have unfolded very differently. But reconnaissance was inadequate because Japanese doctrine emphasized offense over defense. The carriers carried relatively few search aircraft because space was prioritized for attack planes. Japanese cruisers and battleships carried reconnaissance float planes, but these were short-range aircraft useful primarily for spotting gunfire targets. They were not suitable for long-range searches over open ocean. The Americans, by contrast, had extensive land-based search capabilities from Midway. PBY Catalina patrol planes with long range and endurance searched thousands of square miles of ocean. These aircraft detected Japanese forces early, giving American carriers time to position for attack. The fundamental problem was not any single decision. The fundamental problem was a doctrine built for one kind of warfare, being applied to a completely different kind of warfare. Japanese naval doctrine was built for the decisive surface engagement. Everything was optimized for that battle. The carriers were supposed to weaken the enemy before battleships and cruisers closed for the kill. Reconnaissance was designed to support surface combat, not carrier operations. Force structure emphasized battleships as the decisive arm, with carriers in support, but at Midway, carriers were the decisive arm. The battle was fought and decided before Japanese battleships ever came within range of American ships. The surface engagement Yamamoto planned never occurred because the carriers were destroyed before it could develop. Japanese doctrine had not adapted to the reality that carrier aviation was now the dominant form of naval power. Battleships were obsolete. Cruisers were useful only for supporting carrier operations. The decisive battle would be fought by aircraft launched from carriers, not by guns firing from battleships. Midway made this undeniably clear. But the lesson came too late for Japan. The loss of 4 carriers and 3,000 men might have been survivable if Japan had possessed the industrial capacity to replace losses. The United States absorbed similar losses and continued offensive operations because American shipyards could build carriers faster than combat destroyed them. American training programs could produce pilots faster than combat killed them. Japan lacked this capacity. Japanese industry was operating at maximum output before Midway. There was no reserve capacity to increase production. Resources were already scarce. Oil imports were vulnerable to submarine interdiction. The industrial base that might have supported sustained carrier operations did not exist. This reality meant that every loss was irreplaceable. Every carrier sunk was gone permanently. Every trained pilot killed represented skills that took years to develop and could never be recovered. The margin that had existed at the war's beginning, when Japan had more experienced pilots and more operational carriers than the United States in the Pacific, was gone. After Midway, the United States had numerical advantage in carriers. By 1943, American advantage was overwhelming. By 1944, Japan's carrier force was a hollow shell going through the motions of combat while lacking the aircraft and pilots to fight effectively. The Japanese officers who survived Midway understood what had been lost. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and who was aboard Akagi when she was hit, wrote after the war that Midway doomed Japan. The battle had not just destroyed 4 carriers, it had destroyed Japanese naval aviation's offensive capability. The experienced pilots were dead, the carriers were sunk, the margin of superiority was gone. Everything that followed was defensive warfare, fighting to hold what had already been conquered, knowing that every battle would drain forces that could not be replaced. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who commanded the carrier striking force at Midway, would later be relieved of carrier command and assigned to land-based positions. He committed suicide in July 1944 during the battle for Saipan rather than face capture. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, who went down with Hiryu, was considered one of the most brilliant officers in the Imperial Navy. His death deprived Japan of leadership that might have made some difference in the battles that followed. The institutional knowledge lost at Midway extended beyond pilots to the mechanics, ordnancemen, and flight deck crews who kept carrier operations running efficiently. These men were as difficult to replace as pilots. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.